I spent $15,000 on a thermal drone to track life in the Rockies, but I found a hole in reality instead. On a screen where everything living should glow white hot, I tracked a towering 8-foot silhouette that registered at absolute zero. They told me this part of the Rockies was a vacant zone for a reason, but I did not listen until I saw the thermal readout. There are places in the mountains that maps do not name and locals do not visit. They call this drainage area X, a topographic anomaly where global positioning system signals fail and silence feels heavy enough to crush you. I have spent 20 years navigating the high country, and I have learned that when the birds stop singing and the wind refuses to move through the pines, you are standing somewhere you do not belong. I parked my rig on a narrow spine of shale 3 miles from the edge of the drainage. The truck felt like a thin bubble of civilization against the encroaching dark. It was 2:45 in the morning. In the high desert, the air is brittle, carrying the scent of ancient stone and dormant pine. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the screen, and felt that familiar prickle on my neck. It is a primal alarm system that city folks have traded for a cellular telephone signal. In Area X, that alarm was screaming. I moved to the tailgate and began the ritual. In backcountry research, gear is your lifeline. I pulled out the hardened case containing the Matrice 30 Thermal, a $15,000 piece of industrial hardware with a radiometric thermal sensor that can pick up a heartbeat from 300 feet up. I checked the propellers, calibrated the compass, and watched the telemetry flicker on the controller. Usually, you expect a dozen satellites to lock on within seconds. Here, the screen showed 4, then 3. The navigation was drifting, struggling to find a fixed point in this silent zone. The valley below was a jagged scar that seemed to swallow the light, waiting for me to cross the threshold. 3 o'clock in the morning is not just a time. In the wilderness, it is a boundary. It is the moment when thermal contrast is sharpest and when things that hide in the daylight feel safe enough to move. I watched the 4 glowing propellers vanish into the abyss, leaving me with only the pale blue light of the tablet screen. The transition to the infrared spectrum is always jarring. On screen, the lush greens of the Rockies were replaced by a ghostly landscape of blacks and shimmering grays. The trees appeared as cold, skeletal fingers. I pushed the aircraft out to 1,000 feet, banking over the rim of Area X. Telemetry began to fluctuate wildly, the compass spinning as if the mountain itself were trying to confuse the sensors. Despite the interference, the thermal feed remained crisp. I began a systematic grid search, scanning for white-hot signatures. Usually the forest is teeming with heat. You see the bright embers of elk or the small sparks of marmots. But tonight, the screen remained a wash of uniform, icy gray. There was no biological warmth in the entire western sector. It was as if every living thing had fled, leaving behind an empty, barren stage. Just as I prepared to rotate the gimbal toward the creek bed, a flicker of motion caught my eye. Something was standing in the clearing, but it was not showing up as white. I stared at the screen as logic collided with reality. In a thermal world where everything biological should glow with white intensity, I had found a void. In the meadow stood a shape of absolute, bottomless black, a silhouette of freezing cold that moved with fluid grace against the warmer soil. This was a physical impossibility. A living mammal radiates heat that the sensor translates into brightness. This target, however, appeared to be absorbing infrared energy rather than emitting it. It stood approximately 8 feet tall, shoulders broad and blocky, casting no thermal shadow. The sensor indicated the temperature of the object was 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature of the surrounding frozen stone. I lowered the drone to 200 feet, my heart hammering in a steady rhythm. The figure stopped. It did not look around with the frantic energy of an animal. It slowly tilted its head back, staring directly into the lens through 200 feet of pitch-black air. It was as if it could see the invisible infrared light. It remained perfectly still, a static shadow etched into the digital gray. Telemetry began to scroll in gibberish, numbers cycling through hexadecimal codes that made no sense. I was witnessing something that defied every law of biology I had ever learned. Logic tells you it is a rock or a stump, but rocks do not stand on two legs or look up at a drone 400 feet above. I adjusted the zoom, pushing the optics to find a face in that shifting patch of absolute zero. The creature's movement was unlike anything I had witnessed in 30 years of tracking predators. It did not stride. It seemed to displace the air, sliding through dense undergrowth without snapping a twig. In thermal view, the forest usually retains heat footprints for several minutes. This entity left behind nothing but deepening frost. Its presence was siphoning thermal energy out of the mountain, leaving a void of heat in its path. As I watched, the creature reached toward a massive ponderosa pine. The thermal sensor registered the wood turning black on impact, cold spreading through the bark like a toxin. My hands were shaking from the realization that I was looking at something operating on a different frequency of existence. It was a biological contradiction, a towering hunter with the speed of a cheetah and the internal temperature of a glacier. Just as I prepared to engage the high-intensity spotlight, the altitude sensor began to scream. The aircraft was not falling, but the ground was rising to meet it, as if the topography of Area X was shifting in real time. The video feed began to tear. Static crawled across the screen, and the thermal palette inverted, turning the black void into a blinding, ultraviolet flare. The high-definition link dropped from 5 bars to a flickering red warning. The interference felt deliberate, a pressurized wall of frequency designed to blind prying eyes. I fought the sticks, trying to initiate a climb, but the aircraft refused to respond. On the display, the drone's internal temperature plummeted toward 60 degrees below zero, despite the ambient air being a mild 40. The mechanical hum of the motors changed into a jagged, rhythmic pulsing. I attempted to trigger the return to home safety feature, but the screen flashed a critical failure. The internal compass was spinning in a full circle, and the global positioning system coordinates read as 0 degrees latitude and 0 degrees longitude. It was as if the drone had been removed from the known world. I watched, helplessly, as the last frame of the video showed a massive, dark limb reaching upward from the canopy, blotting out the stars. The screen snapped to a hollow, buzzing gray. I was left in the darkness of my truck, the silence outside feeling like an invitation to a tomb. The target was gone from the clearing. It had not run. It had vanished into the upper reaches of the forest with a terrifying agility that defied its scale. I watched the telemetry flatline, leaving me with a haunting awareness that the predator was no longer being tracked. It was doing the tracking. Above the lodgepole pines, the air seemed to thicken, distorting the signal into jagged pulses. Every sweep of the gimbal caught only the vanishing edge of a shadow, a blur of cold air moving faster than the motors could pan. This entity was manipulating the environment, using the forest as a three-dimensional chessboard. I could hear the muffled snapping of heavy branches from miles away, sounds magnified by the valley, as if it were a resonator. The drone felt like a tethered bird being toyed with by an invisible hawk. Flight logs recorded impossible forces, as if something were batting the aircraft with the casual strength of a titan. I realized the creature was not afraid of technology. It was offended by it. A sudden, sharp thud echoed from the roof of my vehicle, followed by a long, slow scrape against the metal. I looked up, but the only thing visible through the sunroof was the moonless, suffocating black of the trees. The signal was cut out. The buzzing static of the tablet was the only light left in the cab. I was left in a silence so absolute, it rang in my ears, 3 miles from a $15,000 aircraft crushed by an invisible hand. In the high country, your vehicle is your fortress. But, as the temperature in the cab dropped unnaturally fast, I knew the fortress had been breached. I had to make a choice. To leave the truck was to enter a breathless world where I was observed. I grabbed my pack and my defensive tool, not for comfort, but for the weight of it. I stepped out, the air hitting my lungs like a mouthful of needles. The hike toward the heart of Area X would take me through 3 miles of vertical terrain and timber so thick starlight could not penetrate it. I moved with the quiet grace of a man who knows every snapped twig is a flare in the darkness. Using a low-frequency red light, I began the trek toward the clearing. The mountain felt different. The soil was too cold, and the rocks vibrated with a sub-audible hum. I was crossing into the ground truth of the valley. Halfway through the first mile, I stopped. The red light caught a patch of frost on a granite boulder, and inside that frost was a handprint the size of a human torso, still steaming. I did not find the drone first. I found the scent, a metallic smell of ozone and wet hair hanging like a thick fog. It was the smell of a lightning strike, mixed with something ancient. I pushed through a curtain of cedar branches and entered the clearing. My headlamp swept across shards of carbon fiber and glass. This was not the wreckage of a fall. The components were scattered in a tight radius, as if dismantled with surgical curiosity. The main chassis was twisted into a jagged spiral, the titanium beams bent with force that would require a hydraulic press. I knelt beside the wreckage, the smell of burnt lithium growing stronger. There were no tracks in the needles around the debris. It was as if the entity had hovered above the ground. I reached toward the mangled frame, but pulled back instantly. The metal was not hot. It was coated in rime ice, so cold it nearly damaged the skin from my fingertips. As I searched for the storage drive, a chattering sound echoed from the trees. It sounded like mechanical encryption being decrypted. Something was watching from the dark, waiting to see if I would take what did not belong to me. My headlamp cut a narrow path, but every time I swung the beam, I caught the tail of a shadow, retreating just beyond the light. The clearing had become a stage, and the forest a dark gallery of unseen spectators. I was an intruder who had breached a private perimeter. The air began to shimmer with localized distortion, and the temperature continued to plummet. I kept my back to a granite outcropping, sweeping the light in a slow arc. I looked for the reflective eyes of an animal, but the light was swallowed. There were no retinas reflecting my beam, only twin points of absolute black that moved in a slow circle. These were voids that consumed light. I could hear the heavy compression of the earth as the entity moved, carrying the rhythmic weight of a heavy heartbeat. The chattering from the canopy had stopped, replaced by a low-frequency hum that made my vision blur. I finally located the small memory card ejected from the drone's housing. My fingers fumbled with the plastic, the cold numbing my joints through tactical gloves. As I pocketed the drive, the circling stopped. The forest went perfectly still, as if the mountain were holding its breath. I realized the perimeter had not just been crossed, it had been closed behind me. In my search, I stumbled over a limestone shelf, that should not have been there. Behind a curtain of moss lay the entrance to a natural fissure, a jagged door into the mountain that radiated a pressure I could feel in my teeth. This was an architectural anomaly, a corridor into a world unmapped by any modern survey. I adjusted my lamp and stepped over the threshold. The scent of ozone vanished, replaced by ancient dust and a dry electric heat humming within the walls. The stone here was smooth, almost polished, showing no tool marks. Deep in the passage, my light caught geometric engravings, complex mathematical arrays that looked like three-dimensional star charts. The corridor sloped downward at a precise 15-degree angle, leading me into the marrow of Area X. Every few steps, the passage widened into alcoves filled with crystalline mounds pulsing with violet light. There were no tracks, yet the air felt occupied, as if the mountain were a living lung. I realized the entity was not just a visitor. It was a guardian of a subterranean highway that had existed since before the first human. A vibrating thrum echoed from further down, a sound so deep it threatened to extinguish my light. I reached to steady myself, but my hand passed through a shimmering veil of air that felt like liquid ice. Deep inside the fissure, the temperature plummeted. My breath froze into a cloud of crystals, and from the darkness I heard that rhythmic, metallic clicking. My headlamp struggled to penetrate the thickening atmosphere, which now seemed composed of translucent vapor. The smooth walls gave way to a subterranean gallery of staggering proportions. Pillars of obsidian stretched into a ceiling my light could not reach, and between them hung glowing webs of violet energy. It was a cathedral of the unknown, an ancient vault where time felt irrelevant. The clicking grew louder, a sequence of tonal shifts resembling high-speed data transmission. I looked at the base of the nearest pillar and saw discarded objects, antlers, stones, and fragments of mining equipment from the 19th century, arranged in perfect concentric circles. The vibration in the floor intensified into a physical pulse that made the stones dance. I was standing in the nerve center of Area X. From behind a massive obsidian column, a tall, slender silhouette stepped into the periphery of my light. It did not possess a face, only a faceted surface, reflecting the violet glow like 1,000 broken mirrors. I found the memory card discarded among obsidian dust. As I pocketed it, a low vibration shook the stones, a warning felt in my marrow. The faceted entity remained motionless, its surface rippling with agitated light. I knew the time for observation had passed. The dry heat was rapidly replaced by a pressurized cold that made the stone groan. I turned toward the incline, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm as I scrambled toward the sliver of moonlight. Behind me, the metallic clicking accelerated into a piercing screech. It was the sound of a system resetting, of a door being locked. The descent had felt like hours, but the scramble back was a blurred eternity of sliding over limestone. I could feel a presence at my back, a wall of kinetic energy pushing me out with violent urgency. I burst through the moss and into the forest, the transition so sudden I nearly fell. I did not stop to scan the trees. I ran, because the mountain was no longer a silent mass of stone. It was a screaming engine of gravity and shadow. I didn't look back. You do not look back when the forest itself is screaming, and the air is thick with ozone. I began a frantic descent, while something moved through the canopy with the momentum of a freight train. The chase was a disruption of the natural order, following my every move. Trees snapped 3 stories up as an invisible hand parted the timber. I threw myself down an embankment of shale, but the sounds above remained synchronized with my pace. Every glance upward caught the shifting of stars as something large and unliving passed between me and the sky. I pushed my body to exhaustion, the thin air burning in my lungs. The entity was herding me toward the ridgeline with calculated precision. I could feel the cold signature radiating from the trees, a localized frost turning leaves into brittle glass that shattered at my touch. The clicking sound returned, amplified by the canyon walls, like 1,000 hammers striking an anvil. I could see the metallic glint of my truck in the distance, a silver speck of hope. But between me and that vehicle, the shadows were coalescing into a wall no man was intended to pass. I reached the truck, hands fumbling keys against cold steel. I slammed the locks just as a massive, cold hand, invisible but heavy, thudded against the window with force that rocked the frame. The glass did not shatter, but frost immediately bloomed from the point of impact. I threw the transmission into gear and floored the accelerator, tires screaming for traction. I lurched forward into a shimmering curtain where trees seemed to bend like a reflection in a pond. I drove straight through it, feeling a jolt of static electricity that caused every light on my dashboard to flare and then go silent. I did not slow down until I had put 10 miles of switchbacks between myself and Area X. In the rear view, the valley was illuminated by a silent pulse of violet light rising into the clouds. The truck's electronics rebooted one by one, but the temperature gauge remained pinned at the lowest reading. I was physically safe, but the weight in my pocket reminded me the encounter was far from over. The extraction was complete, but on the passenger seat I noticed a single obsidian splinter. I was alone in the cab, but the scent of ozone told me something from the mountain had followed me home. Back at the cabin, I plugged the memory card into my laptop. The footage did not show a monster. It revealed a hole in the fabric of reality, looking directly into the camera. The thermal feed showed the moment the drone reached the clearing, but in slow motion, the distortion became clear. The entity was projecting a field that bent light and time. In the last frame before the signal was disconnected, the creature's surface shifted, becoming transparent and revealing a complex, obsidian-like geometry, pulsing with violet light. It looked like a sophisticated probe, an ancient sentinel designed to monitor the threshold. The screen dissolved into buzzing grey, but as the audio looped, I heard it. A clicking that, when slowed down, formed a sequence of coordinates. These were not random. They were a list of every major seismic fault line on the continent. I realized Area X was not just a hiding place, but a nerve center for an intelligence here far longer than us. I sat on my porch until the sun rose, knowing some secrets are kept out of terrifying necessity. The memory card is now hidden where it will never be found by accident, because once you see what hides in the shadows of the Rockies, you can never go back to believing the world is yours. The mountain has ways of ensuring that some truths remain buried, yet the obsidian splinter on the seat is proof that the silence is never truly empty. If you feel the pull of these wild, unexplained places, subscribe and like this video to join our circle of watchers. Share this discovery with those who understand that the maps are still incomplete, and together we will continue to probe the edges of the unknown. Stay vigilant, because in the deep shadows of the high country, something is always looking back. Until next time, keep your eyes on the tree line. The sentinel is still out there.